Hi, good afternoon. My name is Alex Russell. I am project lead for the Dojo toolkit, and I'm not going to talk at all about Dojo today. I also happen to work for a company called SitePen, where I work on Dojo, and I'm not going to talk about them at all either today. So what I am going to talk about is kind of the evolution of browsers and what we can expect out of the next year or two out of that evolutionary process. And in part, the big questions are not necessarily around the browsers themselves, but around the things that might happen outside of browsers or inside of browsers or that might route around browsers. To kind of take stock of the situation, I'm going to try and clarify the discussion into a couple of sets of questions. Where is it that we want to be? Where is it that we are right now? AKA, how far is it to go to get there? How fast are we getting toward where we'd like to be? Why is that rate of change what it is? Fast or slow? Whatever it is, we have to understand what are the levers that are in play, the forces at work that are causing things to work the way they're working, to understand if we can change them, and if we can't change them, how we change them. And then what strategies are affecting that rate of change? What things could we be doing differently as a community, as individuals, as companies, to change the rate of evolution? Okay. So first off, I want to thank Google, not just for hosting this and letting us talk here today, but also they've been tremendous sponsors of Dojo through Summer of Code, through hosting our developer days, through now hosting Dojo on their CDN network. They've been incredible to the project, and they've given a lot back to us, so thank you to Google for that. This talk is kind of an extended version of a hallway conversation I've been having with Joseph Smar and some other people at conferences for the last 9 months. It's not much more or less than that, except that it's got some data attached to it. And part of that discussion has been around, okay, we're all building web applications today because web applications give us the ability to get our application in front of everybody yesterday. As soon as it's launched, someone can go to our URL, they can pull up our application. There isn't any more friction than typing in the URL and maybe signing up for an account. And signing up for an account with a lot of the work that's happening with open authentication and shared auth work is kind of going away as well. We want our applications to be cheap to build. This has always been true, but cheap is always a relative term. Cheap compared to what? Cheap compared to hardware, cheap compared to other software that we're using, cheap compared to the man hours. Those things all change in relationship to the cost of the other inputs. And so the old trope is trotted out every 6 hours at a conference that hardware is really, really cheap now and that everything else is more expensive. And therefore, you can ignore algorithms, or you can ignore the cost of inefficient things somewhere else in your stack. But what about people? People are expensive now compared to machines. People are now expensive compared to code. But some code is more expensive than other code. Why is some code more expensive than other code? We want applications that are useful and engaging compared to the other apps that people are using, right? We want our application to look better, to be more interactive, to be more responsive, and to solve more of a user's problems. And we want them to handle harder sets of problems. We want to be handling problems on the web that were only possible to handle on the desktop before. And so getting there requires new capabilities. And we want to preserve the value that the web has given our applications so far. So we want our apps to be able to be searched. We want to be able to link to applications. We want to be able to link to data insofar as it's captured inside of applications. And we want to be able to remix that stuff out. We want to be able to do mashups. We want to be able to take those components, plop them out, sometimes with permission, often without, and make sure that it'll all work together, which is kind of a new thing for us. So how are we in relationship to that goal? And the answer is kind of, it depends on what you're trying to get done right now. And so right now, there's a whole series of applications which are kind of the dumb equivalents of their previous desktop counterparts. So you would have a VB application that someone sat in and they'd type in very quickly what it is that they wanted to get done. It would be persisted to a database. Everyone on the local network would be able to get at it very quickly. And now you have multi-step pages that you have to get through. You have to sign into your thing. It actually kind of takes a lot more, but you can get at it from anywhere. So this is obviously the old advantage for having something on the web. And webs that can be represented by relatively static series of pages are very well served by the current browser technology. So this talk is a lot about what the browsers are giving us with regards to how we present our apps. And part of that is that the browsers today have a very strong emphasis or bias towards text. Everything is text on the wire, more or less. Even references to images are text on the wire. You don't have images embedded in your document per se. Video is similarly a call out. It's not part of the document itself. And the textual nature of the web has both defined the kinds of applications that you build with it and the way that it's deployed. And then that has profound effects for all of the other things that happen around it. The ecosystems that get built up around the web, single pages, applications, all that stuff is based on the assumption that the web is text. And when that assumption changes, a lot of the things that we thought we would always be able to do with the web change. So if you're trying to do anything that's not pretty much a static set of pages or can be easily represented by a static set of pages, when you want to push the boundaries, things get really, really, really hard right now. My days are consumed with building a JavaScript toolkit that makes some of those really hard things a little bit easier. It doesn't make all of them easier, and there are a whole class of things that we can't even begin to approach. So I kind of feel like this is where we are right now with the web. We've got these really long, well-paved roads, and everything kind of has to conform down the road. And the road is defined by what a browser can consume. Text on the wire, it's got to be markup driven, it's got to be able to have a turn signal, be able to get to 60 miles an hour, and be able to survive a crash, right? I mean, those are pretty much the rules of the road, and if your content can't do that, it can't survive. And we're trying to make our content fly, and we're not having a lot of luck with it, because the dual constraints of what the road is expecting of us, what its constraints were built to enforce in order to provide safety, in order to provide ubiquity, in order to let me be able to travel on a road in California the same way that I travel on a road to Nevada as soon as I cross the state boundary. All of those barriers have already been cut away for me. We already know what all of those things look like. And now changing the entire system is very, very, very difficult. And as a result, whenever you want to do something that isn't well served by putting some wheels on a road, things get hard. So Doug Crockford, who I don't think is actually in here, but it is at the conference, said in a talk, I think 8-9 months ago, that we're so far from the state of the art that we can't even see the state of the art from where we are. And what he meant by that was that there's a whole series of capabilities in your laptop, in your desktop, even in your phone, that the web can't even begin to address. We don't have access to those capabilities from the devices that we're on. We can't get access to the camera. We can barely draw 2D vector graphics. We can't transform any images, even though we've all got GPUs that could do thousands or hundreds of image and matrix manipulations per tenth of a second. We've got local storage that's gigabytes and gigabytes and gigabytes. We've got RAM. We can't even tell how much RAM we're taking in our application in JavaScript these days. So there's a whole series of things that we'd love to be able to do. We can't open up a socket. We can't talk to the file system. We can't store code locally. We can't, I mean, the list of we can't starts with what you want to do. And as a result, the web is constrained to a very narrow band of what it is that we think a web application is. YouTube starts to break us out of that, and the way it does it is through a plugin. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But one of the things that's a huge beneficial outcome of the entire web being text-based and being markup-driven is that we get positive externalities from that. There's a whole series of things that happen once I've published my page onto the web that have nothing to do with me. They have to do with someone else being able to take my content and do something smarter with it. In this case, the anchor tag. The anchor tag lets my document say to some other document, first it lets the user go to the other document, right? That's simple. But it also lets something that's analyzing my document go and find the other documents that are related. It lets it go and draw relationships between them. This is what Google is. This is what search engines do. Search engines, and in particular PageRank, the algorithm that Google initially launched on, are designed to help you find more stuff based on the stuff that you're on and what it's related to. Help you find and discover the relationships between things. And this is intrinsically part of the textual nature of the web. If the web wasn't text, if you had to run a client that wasn't just a regular expression engine or a big old text parser or even a headless browser, you'd have to do very different things because you couldn't count on this semantic being what it was that expressed those relationships. And so the semantic agreement about what it is that takes me from one page to another turns out to have all kinds of positive secondary and tertiary benefits, which you couldn't have predicted when the hyperlink was invented. I mean, maybe you could have through the backlink system, which never really materialized, but it was never assumed that you would have something over on the side that would go make all of this stuff work. But the textual and open nature of the content on the wire itself made all of this possible. And we also have huge negative externalities. We have what is essentially pollution in terms of application development costs. We're now wading through the toxic sludge of browsers that can't get off of the web. We can't go throw every grandmother's Windows ME box out and go replace it with an iMac, much as we'd love to. Even if it was economically feasible, we just can't go and find all the grandmothers with a Windows ME box. And as a result, we're currently constrained in what we can build, not only by the capabilities of the newest browsers that we've got, but by how fast we can flush the old browsers out of the ecosystem. If we can't flush the old browsers out, we don't actually get new stuff, because what you get on the web as a developer is what's ubiquitous. And if something is ubiquitous, you can use it. And if it's not ubiquitous, you can't really use it for anything critical. And so we're constrained by that tail, I will not use that phrase, the tail of stuff that we can't flush out of the web. There's always been a boat anchor, right? There's always been the web's worst browser. It used to be Netscape 3, and then it was Netscape 4, which would never freaking die, and then it was IE 6, and it's going to be something tomorrow, right? Maybe it's going to be Firefox 2. Maybe it's going to be Safari 2. God, I can't wait for Safari 2 to be dead. It can't happen soon enough. Safari 2 is terrible compared to Safari 3. But it's a minority market share browser. It's got an auto-upgrade path. It can flush out quickly. But we always have this boat anchor on the web that's holding us back. So we've got positive and negative externalities that we're fighting with. And the question about what you're going to choose to build your next application isn't a question about whether or not those things are true. It's a question about the relative weights. Is it relatively more valuable for me to be able to hyperlink my application or to hyperlink from my application than it is for the development cost I have to pay in order to get the damn thing to work in IE6? Those are the questions that businesses face. It's not whether or not something is right and wrong. It's about how much it costs. And so we have to understand how much the environment that we're working in costs us all the time in order to understand whether or not this platform has a shot at winning the next rev. And so the HTML, JavaScript, those kinds of things, the open web have a really strong story right now with regards to the number of people who know how to produce HTML. Now, the counter-argument from programmers, and I'm going to divide these classes of people pretty strongly. There are programmers and then there are web developers, and I don't mean that in the pejorative sense, but what I mean is that the web has cut people who are not and don't want to be programmers into the process of building things for end users. Tools can do that too, but HTML did a really good job of it. And so developers of every stripe know HTML. They can produce HTML. They can bicker about HTML. They can yell at each other when their HTML is semantic or not semantic or conformant or not conformant or using CSS or tables or whatever gets the job done. But people know HTML. And systems that we use to build web apps are strongly biased towards being giant text pumps. This is the biggest problem with Java as a language for building web applications. Java is a terrible language for manipulating text, except it turns out the entire web is text. So languages like Ruby and Python and Perl do a really good job at building web applications because they would do a much better job at mangling text. And so the other side of it, the flip side of it, the positive externality side of it is not only can you hire someone who knows how to mangle text for you, the search engines only understand HTML today. Now, there are other types of static document formats that they can get at. And largely, they get at them by turning them into something that looks a lot like text. But it's really hard to understand what's inside of a compiled Flash application. It's very hard to understand the semantic or the structure of an applet. It's very hard to understand what the person who was putting the information or the application online meant when they sent down some compiled XAML. There's a serious barrier to those positive externalities taking back over again when we're talking about things that aren't text on the wire and HTML. And there's a whole series of applications that we can't even begin to attempt with HTML right now. This is a huge problem. And it's a problem because it creates opportunity. Well, okay, problem/opportunity. It creates opportunity for things that aren't HTML insofar as those other kinds of applications are things that people really, really, really want to build. Why aren't we doing Photoshop on the web with a regular browser? Why do we require Flash and Flex? Why can't we do video on the web without a plugin? These are really important questions, and I think we all kind of get stopped at the state of the art and say, well, the licensing for the codecs is hard, and you'd never get a browser into people's hands fast enough. But it doesn't answer the fundamental question of why can't we do it in a browser? Or why shouldn't we do it in a browser, which I think is the more accurate question to ask. Why are we not asking our browser vendors to give us those things and not to give us, I don't know, a tag that lets you do clear left easier? A lot of things in HTML5 look like they're not really addressing new kinds of applications, while some of those things in HTML5 look they really are. There's a series of things that are also really close, and some things that are very far. There's a whole series of capabilities which we can get at with high cost, or for whom the performance is not uniform enough to be ubiquitous. But there's another class of things where there aren't even the fundamental building blocks. And so I think in the things that are kind of almost, in that almost category, we're going to get to pretty ubiquitously very soon because the JavaScript toolkits, the Ajax toolkits, plugins are going to get us there very fast. The stuff that's no chance, we're not going to get it inside of the current context. We're not going to get it inside of regular old HTML until we do something fundamentally different about how we think about the browser. So who's playing? HTML is playing. HTML doesn't know that it's playing because HTML doesn't have anyone pushing HTML. HTML is an ownerless, loveless, hated by all, used by everyone standard that lets us push stuff out. HTML plus other stuff has a constituency. People who are using Ajax and Flash to build applications know that stuff costs a lot to build. They're staring down the costs of building new and harder things every day, and they're crying for more. They're asking for more because they're asking me and they're asking a lot of the other people that I work with every day to please make the pain stop. The other option here is pure JavaScript. Now, of course, pure JavaScript is not what you'd call a real technology. But what I mean by this is JavaScript that doesn't use semantics of markup at all. So if you look at HTML plus other stuff, what you wind up with is structure or the document as describing the data that you're looking at and potentially the relationships between it, and then sprinkling some other stuff onto it to make it more interactive. The pure JavaScript route is to say, you've got a head tag, you've got a body tag, you've got a script tag in there someplace, and then look, there's your app, right? This is not HTML as we know it. It is a different thing. We don't have a term for it yet. But it is a different thing. It is a different beast. There's Silverlight, which can play in all of these camps, right? It can be HTML plus other, or it can be the full thing. And we've got Flex, which is very much the same in the same vein, where it can be the other in HTML plus other, or it can be the whole thing. And the game right now, for all these technologies, is to get ubiquity and capability such that users' problems go away with reasonable cost. HTML is the most ubiquitous, right? Like we can look at this in descending order from ubiquity to capability. Ascending order. HTML is the most ubiquitous thing. And we know that it's the most ubiquitous thing because all of the other things that are trying to play through HTML now. Nothing else is trying to get into this ecosystem by putting a new browser on your desktop. Those days are done. No one else is putting a new browser on your desktop unless it's a fundamentally new media type. So Songbird represents a series of fundamentally new media types, so they put a new thing on your desktop. Everybody else decides that they're going to go play inside of the browser Chrome because it's the only thing that can get them ubiquity fast enough. Pure JavaScript, when you turn on JavaScript, you lose some people. You lose some people on devices that can't downgrade the content. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in just a bit, but there's a switch here that happens when you talk about structure plus behavior and then move to just pure behavior. And that switch is degradability. And it comes by lots of different names. Some people call it accessibility. Some people call it semantic markup, which I think is a really loaded term that I'm not going to use a lot of. I believe in small s semantics, and we're going to be talking about small s semantics every time I say that word today. So if you're an RDF partisan, don't lynch me. But that's what I mean. And when you get into things that turn on that big JavaScript flag, that require it for core application behavior, or require it for core behavior, or plugins for core behavior, you lose some people. And those people are your marginal audiences. Those people are your marginal audiences collectively, and they're your marginal audiences. Depending on your application, they can be your core audience, or they can be an audience that you care a lot about. So if you're building an advertising site, you probably don't care about them a lot. If you're building advertising that's going to go onto somebody else's site, you care about them a lot. So you're going to build a fallback version. So we need ubiquity and capability. Anything that doesn't have ubiquity and that doesn't have enough capability to solve a problem loses the race. It's not even a contender. And so the question now for HTML and HTML plus Ajax is, can you have enough capability to even be in the race anymore? They've clearly got the ubiquity, but can they get the capability? The other side of it, Silverlight and Flex, clearly have the capability. They can do anything and everything. They get us a lot closer to the state of the art that we can't see from HTML. But they do it potentially at the cost of ubiquity. Now, there's good stories there for both of those technologies, and we can talk about them at length if you want. Now, we'll take questions at the end, I guess, but we'll save a lot of time for that. So I had this slide in here, and I was talking to Joseph. Again, I hate to keep pointing you out. And I think it's a good question for us to try to collectively wrangle with, which is it the web if you can't view source on it? If I can't do a control U or an open apple U and figure out kind of what the guy meant when I put the page on that, when he published the page, is it still the web? And the answer that Joseph gave me was not the web I love, which struck me as deeply true. Because there's something about the social effects of the technical decisions that we're making. So I mentioned developers versus web developers earlier. And what I meant by that is that developers as a class, people who have a lot of pride in their engineering background, are quick to throw disdain both on other developers who don't happen to share their particular religious views, but also on people who aren't real developers, people who are just hacking stuff together, people who don't understand how it all works, don't understand that there's a socket system which is opening up with the right ioctals in order to implement HTTP, which is doing all this stuff under the covers, and can't talk about the specifics of cache control headers with regards to HTTP. If you can't do that, you're not in their game, and they don't really care about you. And one of the democratizing things about HTML, and one of the maddening things for a lot of people I know who are like serious developers, is that they view this sudden influx of people who aren't serious developers who can build stuff as this huge travesty. They make these gigantic messes. It barely works. And for those people, it's the biggest, most liberating thing that ever happened to technology for them. They can build stuff. It kind of works. Holy crap. They didn't, I mean, seriously, right? This is not your precious, ivory castle being dismantled piece by piece. This is the bazaar being built at the bottom of it so you can get a sustainable society and an ecosystem and a commerce system and potentially roads so that you don't have to go taxing serfs all the time in order to keep your ivory tower intact. You can just do it as part of a lower and lower and lower marginal tax. But this message doesn't really get through very often. And as a result, I think we're very quick as developers to throw view source under the bus. And I want to talk about the effects of that. So we've got this continuum, right? On the one side is lower s semantic markup, stuff that is just markup that'll run everywhere. If you can parse HTML and you can display text on the screen, you can give the user some sort of an experience for this. And that speaks to cost of delivering that experience. The experience doesn't have a very high dynamic range, right? It'll never do huge, whizzy, animated stuff that then goes out and makes all kinds of sophisticated calls to a database and can do things, but it's going to present you with the data right here, right now, and let you interact with it in some very constrained, low-resolution way. We can upgrade that with stuff like Ajax toolkits, where you can add stuff to that markup and then get a better experience if you can handle it, and not if you don't. And you can make huge messes at every point along this continuum. I just want to make that very clear before I get the inevitable question of, well, if I use JavaScript, well, then aren't I shutting people out? You might be if you're doing it wrong. So somewhere along this continuum, you've got this dead spot in the middle here, where you're writing in something that bootstraps you from markup, but isn't providing you any semantic information at all, really. And then you've got things like Silverlight, which are giving you lots of semantics, but not in an agreed-upon format. There's a single vendor who controls what those semantics mean, and they're not really amenable to the kind of contract that we understood when we built the rest of the web, right? That anchor tag doesn't mean anything in Silverlight yet. You have to go and rebuild those semantics if you're building a Silverlight app, or a Flex app, or a GWT app. And GWT gets you, it's that pure JavaScript answer, right? Body tag, head tag, body tag, JavaScript include. It's an app. And then you get Flex. And so for all of these things down this continuum, you've got things that are completely durable. You've got stuff which can survive being run through the laundry. It can, it can be printed on a business card and then typed back in later. And if you pull it up in a browser and the person who typed it in is a really bad speller, you'll still get the basic idea of what it is they were trying to say. Versus stuff that comes down the wire as code, where if the slightest bit or byte is wrong, it doesn't render at all. There's a huge world of difference here in terms of durability, survivability of the content that you're trying to send. And that speaks to remixability. So I can take content that comes down the wire as text, as lowercase semantic markup, shove it through anything, put it back into a web page, and look, it renders. I get something out of it. If I try and do the same thing with a Silverlight document, the odds are really low that I'm going to get the same stuff back out that I thought I put back in part because it didn't have very much fidelity to start with. And this is a fundamental trade-off that I think we're all wrestling with, but we aren't thinking about it rigorously, which is, what are we trading off when we want fidelity out of the experience that we're delivering? And how much do we have to trade off? What parts of those trade-offs are implicit in building a higher fidelity experience? And which parts of those trade-offs are implicit? Which parts of the things are just us not asking for enough out of our platform vendors? So there's another kind of continuum here. Is something web-ish, or is it kind of like a desktop app? And this is not really a technology decision. It's kind of what you choose to build with it. And right now, this decision is informed by how much it costs to build a particular kind of experience in a particular technology. So building a desktop-like application or building a desktop-like experience with straight-up XHTML is a real pain. You're not going to do it because you're not going to get there unless you choose a particular browser that does some funky, non-standard stuff. On the other side of it, just putting a static document on the web is really hard to do in Silverlight and Flex. Yes, you pull the expression web, paste in your text, put it up there. Sure, but it's not any. You don't open up a text editor and say body, paste, body. That's really all it takes to put something on the web in regular HTML. And so as the cost to do things changes, as the users who know how to do those things changes, the experiences that get delivered in those particular technologies also start to change. And the end game right now is the browsers suck, right? For a whole range of particular application, browsers suck a lot. It's really hard to do anything moderately sophisticated with any browser. Because you don't get to do it with just that browser, you get to do it with every browser, or it doesn't actually work. It doesn't count. So the important question is, will browsers always suck if we have a hope of continuing to do things inside of browsers? So one potential evolutionary path for us is for us to always be doing stuff inside of a browser, right? Inside of that ubiquitous Chrome that boots up a different renderer. Maybe we boot up Silverlight. Maybe we boot up Flex. Maybe we boot up, who knows, something else. Maybe we boot up a local HTML renderer or SGML renderer or FOP viewer of our choice inside of that Chrome, and it just happens to be delivered through an HTML viewer. Is that going to be the way we go, or are we going to continue to try and push on HTML to get us to where we want to go with fewer and fewer add-ons to get to the same experience? So I think it's important for us to talk about what does it mean for a browser to suck. And I'm going to argue that there's two kinds of sucking. There's sucking that can't be where you can't begin to handle the problem, and we mentioned this earlier, right? 3D. Like, I can't rotate an image in a browser. It's insane. I can't just say, twist it 90 degrees in 3D space, right? How hard should that be? My GPU can do that a zillion times a second. And then there's sucking where the cost is in the implementation differences. The cost is in not that it can't theoretically be done, but in that it can't be done by mortals. And so we have a whole series of toolkits now which cost a lot. They're expensive to use. They're expensive to use because they require a lot of code. You have to send that code down the wire every time. There's a huge incremental cost to choosing to use a JavaScript toolkit to upgrade HTML to get to some of this incremental value. And so even if it isn't too complex, it might be too expensive. It might impair your ability to deliver the same experience across multiple devices, because if you're going to be choosing to use an upgrade to HTML like JavaScript, and your mobile phone can't handle that JavaScript, it doesn't matter. Or if the phone network can't handle that JavaScript, what might have been a rational choice on a local gigabit Ethernet connection is no longer a rational choice over an HSPDA connection. HSDPA. Yeah. So there's a whole series of suckage on the spectrum of suck. And there's an important set of questions about which should we deal with most urgently, and who do we ask for to solve them. So fundamentally, it all comes back to the browser vendors. They've got to solve some of this. But there's some of it that we can solve on our own. And how much headroom do we have there? How much more of this can we solve on our own before we have to go begging and pleading and crying to the browser gods for something better? Because we no longer have the headroom. We no longer have more cost. And so part of this is down to Moore's law and the amount of space that we've got on the network. And part of this is down to the algorithms and the deployed browsers that we've got to work with, because things that are cheap on one browser might be expensive on another browser across the exact same hardware and network connection. But the other part of it is for the things that we can't, let me go back. For the things that are in this first category, things that we can't begin to handle without some kind of native capability built into the browser, we have to go ask someone who's in a position of more leverage to get it for us. And so we're staring down the question of who has more leverage. And the people who have more leverage are the people who are shipping compiled code, and that's not us. We're not shipping compiled code as web application developers, generally speaking, because it's expensive, it's slow, it's hard, it's really hard to change once you've shipped it down the wire, and we've gotten a lot of leverage out of letting other people ship the compiled code, and we just write our little script, and look, it all works. And we've counted on competition to get us to where we want to be so far. Competition has saved us to date, we think. And so it's worth asking, how well is competition working? And I think the answer right now, I wouldn't have said this 9 months ago, but the answer right now is competition is working pretty darn well. This year, we're going to get Firefox 3. It's going to be an auto upgrade. Everyone who's running Firefox 2 and has a network connection is going to get Firefox 3. Safari, you'll get it when it's done, I guess. They won't tell you. But the nightlies are awesome. You should totally try them. They're also usually pushed through software update. There has never been a stated browser policy from Apple, but the last 2 major OS revs have shipped a downrev port of the newest version of Safari to the old OS and made the new Safari the default with no fallback and no way to go back on the new OS. Now, this is a nice artifact of them being a minority market share browser, and OS platform, but it works nicely. Opera 9.5 is going to come out sometime this year. You'll get an upgrade notice. It'll tell you to go download it, and it usually just works. IE8, it's really complicated. And I don't mean this by way of teasing our good friends at Microsoft. I mean this by saying that they're in the minority and monopoly market share position right now. And so for them, everything they do is really hard. It's really hard to be in this position because everything you do, someone yells at you for. Do you remember when we were yelling at Netscape for everything they did? We did. We seriously did. Everything they did, every time they made a mistake, every time they failed to ship a new feature, it was the evil folks at Netscape. It helped that they were a small startup who were under serious competition issues from a monopoly desktop vendor. But IE is now in the unenviable position, and has been for a long time, of trying to satisfy everyone all at once. And so the question is this a position that's always going to be blessed or cursed onto somebody who happens to be in that position? And the only thing we've got to look at is history. And so this was the usage curve of Netscape back in the day, quote unquote, back in the day. The version number is really irrelevant here, but the versions that really mattered were the 3.0 and 3.2 and 4.x versions for this curve. And what you see here is that they went from 0, which is to say no market at all, to a monopoly in about 2 years. Netscape was absolutely in the monopolist position in about a year and a half, and then continued to move Mosaic and Amaya and everything else out of the way at blistering pace. And then IE did the same thing. So look at the slope of the initial uptake curve here. What we've got here is a curve where IE went from, relatively speaking, 0. IE 3 was pretty much the first IE that shipped, I think, by default with any major operating system. It was part of NT4. And by 2000, IE was clearly in a monopoly market share position. They had over 75% of the market. And by 2002, they had 90% of the market. And between 96 and 2002, they shipped 14 major releases across 4 major platforms. Do you remember? Does anyone remember seeing IE running on top of a deck, on top of an alpha box? That was slick. That thing was fast. NT ran in a lot of places, and so did IE. And there was also IE for Mac as well. And between 2002 and 2008, we've had 2 major releases. Now I'm going to get some pushback from Chris about IE 7 or 6 SP2 on XP. But let's just say that we've had 2 major releases in the same equivalent time period as there were 14 major releases before that. So competition failed us, right? Competition failed us pretty badly. And if we look back at the other chart here, what we've got is, come on. Fail. Slide fail. So we've got 0 to monopoly, and we've got, relatively speaking, the same thing across the 2 major browsers over time that we've seen so far in the marketplace. So the question is there a natural monopoly for browsers? Should we always expect there to be a monopoly market share browser? And if we should, how does that change the way we think about it? Because we know that if we look at like Flash and we look at Silverlight and we look at these closed-ish platforms, what you've got is a monoculture. And the monoculture is really easy to develop for because there's only one person to yell at. And they give it to you or they don't, but you know where you stand. On the web, there's lots of people to yell at. You're not even sure who to yell at sometimes, so we got a lot of web developers who are yelling at the W3C because they can't do anything. Seriously, they have no power. They've got all the authority, but they've got no power. You've got people yelling at browser vendors, but which one do you yell at? Do you yell at Microsoft? Do you yell at Mozilla? If you yell at Mozilla, and Mozilla does something, and then Microsoft does it because Mozilla does it, does that mean that you should yell at Mozilla more or that you should yell at Microsoft more? Right? These are really important questions for figuring out how we get new stuff into the fabric of the web. And no one's really sure right now. And the other thing we know is that monocultures can deliver stuff really fast because they get to choose. They get to tell you what it's going to look like. The flip side of only having one person to ask is only having one person to blame. So when you get the new version of Windows, you get the new version of Windows. It's not like getting a new version of Linux, right? Every new choice between a new version of Linux is not whether or not you're going to be using version Fedora 4 or Fedora 3. It's, are you going to be using Fedora 4 or are you going to switch to SUSE? Are you going to switch to Ubuntu? It's pretty sexy. Looks good. You have a whole choice, range of choices, and you can switch out any of those at any time. And so progress is much more hodgepodge, and it's much harder to track. It's also much harder to figure out where you're going to exert leverage. And so the traditional answer has been that we exert leverage through standards bodies. We get everyone in a room, we yell at them to go figure it out, and then they go figure it out and they give it to us. And the question has kind of been, okay, let's yell at everyone to get in a room, but if browsers are prone to natural monopolies, does it matter who's in the room? If there's going to be a natural monopoly, does who's in the room affect who's going to have the monopoly next? Does it affect who you're going to hand the baton off the next time someone decides that they're going to build a world-beating browser? Or does that person go off and let everyone else in the room duke it out while they go build an awesome thing over here that goes and takes market share, right? These are important questions because if we don't know the answer to them, we don't know how to get new stuff. And we don't know what it's going to look like when a new thing comes along. I think there's another important question for web developers, not necessarily for browser vendors, but for web developers, which is how do our attitudes towards the monopoly browsers change if we expect them? Right now, we don't expect them. Web developers we always behave like we've been put upon. We always behave like someone did something bad to us every time we wind up in a situation where there's a monopoly market share browser and we can't get rid of it, or we can't change it, or we don't feel like we can change it, because we're not really paying attention to the economics that are involved in how the browser got to where it is. And so if we expect a monopoly market share browser, how does that change who we ask and what we ask for? This is an open question. I don't have an answer, but I think we need to figure it out pretty fast. So the other side of it, we saw this before. We got web-ish and we got desktop-ish. There are implications for content, right? So if I'm content, I want to be consumed by the largest number of things possible. I want to be, on an evolutionary basis, I want the most things to be able to come along, chew me up, and spit me out in order to reproduce faster, right? You can think of content like fruit that have seeds, right? You want the seeds to be spread as far and wide, and so you build really tasty fruit. And so content does that today by straddling more and more browsers. In order to get prettier and prettier stuff, you have to expend more and more effort. And so you wind up with these local maxima, right? You wind up with peacock feathers, where you might not have a predator now, but you're putting so many resources into those feathers that the next alligator to come along is going to totally munch you up. You're not going to have a chance when the environment changes out from underneath you because you've evolved to a particular browser. So this is why I think the web development community has hewed so tightly to standards, because we've done this. We've done this a lot. We've seen people get caught up in a valley where there's lots of one kind of predator and not another, and they go and they grow all kinds of features to this valley, and then their seeds get put someplace else and they die. Right? Their content can't survive because they over-evolved to a particular location, and that location is a browser. And so standards were our way out, but standards apparently haven't gotten us the ability to survive in the face of things which provide brand new capabilities. We're dinosaurs, they're mammals, we don't have an answer right now, right? We don't have an answer through the standards process and through the browser process, as far as we can see, to getting sexy animations, to getting transitions, to getting drop shadows that we don't have to go build 9 images for, to getting rounded corners. Jesus, what does it take to get rounded corners on a box? Or to transform it slightly, right? How hard would that be? I mean, this is not hard on today's hardware, but it's really, 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 really hard on today's browsers. And so we've got a bunch of things which are hostage to their landscape, right? We've got all kinds of content which is wildly successful. It has all of the momentum, but we've got this new set of species invading, and we don't know what to make of them. And we're finding out is that content which has been evolved to this landscape is hostage to that landscape. We're all hostage to this environment because we don't know how to change our environment. We haven't built land-moving equipment yet. And so these other things can rev a lot faster. They have less content, right? Flex and Silverlight have a lot less content to worry about. They are not in a monopoly position. They are ubiquitous in some sense, but they don't really have to worry too much about it yet, not the way that a browser vendor does. And there aren't specs tying them down, right? So what we saw over here was that we had people get into the valley of single vendorness and go, oh my God, I'm in the valley of single vendorness. Quick, standards body, get me out. And they kind of did for a little while. But that didn't happen over here, and it won't happen over here because the expectation hasn't been set that there should be multiple people consuming this content, right? So until there's multiple renderers consuming any piece of content, there's never any competition, good, bad, natural monopoly, not natural monopoly, for consuming Flex, consuming Silverlight content, consuming content which is not text on the wire necessarily. And so we have some important questions to ask about who gets paid how. So if we look at Flex and we look at Silverlight, these are transparent platform plays, right? You build and give away the platform, and then you build and sell the development stuff, right? You sell the development stuff. And you can sell the development stuff and always be in a position of power there because you don't have to answer to anyone else about what the standard is going to look like next. There's no question about whether or not you're going to be in a favored position to influence the standard and then provide tools that are appropriate to that standard and the implementations that fall out of it. So you get all kinds of great control with regards to the experience that you can build, and as a result, you get a little bit of control about what kind of tools you want to build on top of that experience and some foreknowledge. So it's an asymmetric information problem. For browser vendors, the calculus is totally switched. If they're as standards compliant as the next browser vendor, they're only as standards compliant as the next browser vendor, right? There's no sustainable advantage in being more standards compliant, right? And what we've seen is that the standards don't give us the new stuff. It's only people evolving new features on the side and then getting it rolled into the standards that gets us new stuff. So when web developers yell at browser vendors to be more standards compliant, what are they asking for? They're asking for it to cost less to do what they expect, but they're not asking for new stuff. You're not fundamentally asking for anything better. You're asking for everything to be the same. So are we asking for a monoculture? And is this the best way to get it? Is asking standards bodies and asking browsers to conform to standards the best way to get our monoculture? Or should we all go use one browser? These are important questions. But let's look at how browser vendors get paid. This is how browser vendors get paid. This is the money, right? This is it. That's all there is. There's no other revenue stream aside from that search box, right? Where does Mozilla get paid from? Mozilla gets paid from that search box. Where does Opera get paid from? That search box. Where does Safari get paid from? That search box. Now, these all say Google, but that's just an artifact, right? Wouldn't it be really smart of a company to make sure that they were the default? That'd be awesome. So they don't make any money on the renderer, right? The people who are slaving away, taking all these complaints, taking all this criticism, yelled at to go to standards meetings, which suck hard. Standards meetings are terrible. These people who take all of this crap from us and who we feel very put upon by, don't make any money off of us, right? They make money off of those integrations. The Chrome, the stuff that goes around the renderer, is much more important. It's much more critical to the business, and the reason that the renderer has to be there is in order to get that browser in front of people. It has to not be a negative. It can never be a huge positive, but it can always be a huge negative, right? For me, when I go to a restaurant, I don't eat mushrooms, and it's not that I don't like the taste, it's that I don't like the texture. Texture, for me, is one of those things that can never be a huge positive. I'm never chewing into a gummy bear and going, oh my god, the texture's so great. Texture is always, it's either neutral or terrible for me. And I think renderers are very much the same way for browser vendors. Some things can taste great. Sugar is awesome. But there's no sugar in renderers right now. There's nothing for them to get paid by. So what are our other options if the browser vendors are going to always be paid, or at least this is the business model du jour, not for the renderer, not for the thing that we care about, not for the thing that we're yelling at them to do, but for the Chrome that goes around it. If that's their business, how do we get the new stuff, and how do we ensure that we continue to get new stuff faster? What are our options? We can go yell at them, right? We can go yell at browser vendors till we're blue in the face, and we might get something. Competition is our only leverage there. Competition is the only thing that actually puts a browser vendor in the room to go and do it because the other guy did it. Or they'll do it first, and therefore you'll like them better and evangelize their browser. But that's not a huge win, it's a small win. There's a lot more leverage to be had through a good marketing campaign, through good advertising, through better security, through integration with the desktop, through integration with some kind of an operating system. Those are much more powerful than what you and I say about their browser. We can yell at the standards bodies. We know that if we yell at the standards bodies, what we'll get is a lot of nothing. Okay. We can keep trying it. If you've got a good idea for how we can get something useful out of a standards body that wasn't preceded by a good implementation in our browser, I would love to hear about it. But I don't know that we've got any serious proof yet that that's going to work. And the other option is that we try to route around it. Right? So we've said that browser vendors get paid by the Chrome, but they build these renderers as a product. They bundle them up, they sell them as a product. Right? You get the thing, it goes on your desktop, it's the thing. And what we've got plugins. Plugins are renderers that happen to live inside that same Chrome, but they don't ship as a product because the revenue stream is different than that. The revenue stream isn't the thing that's in front of you. The revenue stream is the thing that you're building, the thing that you put in front of the user. Right? The revenue stream is developer tools. The revenue stream is support. The revenue stream is all kinds of things that aren't tied to the actual thing in front of the user necessarily. I think our best option right now is something like Gears. And this is not just because I'm in Google's house. It might be the reason I got asked to speak here. But I'm actually kind of a fan of the way that Gears is doing this. So we have a big risk. We're staring down a big risk, right? Our big risk is that we're going to get left at the altar again. That some browser vendor is going to say, I give up. Right? If it was Mozilla today, it would still hurt just as much as if it was Microsoft. Let's be clear. Mozilla's got 30% market share in Europe. If Mozilla quit tomorrow, if Google stopped paying Mozilla for that search box placement, or if their revenue stream dried up, we'd still be over a creek, right? There's stopper market share, and then there's monopoly market share, and they're slightly different. Monopoly market share defines where things can go without having to ask permission. Stopper market share tells you where things can't go. So anyone who's got enough market share to be a stopper in the market can keep things from going to a particular location. And this is the role of the boat anchor, right? This is the role of the thing that you can't get rid of. Because once you can't get rid of it, you can't change it, and therefore you can't change what ubiquitous means. And when you can't change what ubiquitous means, that person has real vote. That vote counts. And so we need to be able to route around that risk. That's the big iceberg on the horizon, is how do we keep ourselves. How do we build a network that lets us say there's no ice that way, there's no ice that way, we can go straight that way? And I think Gears is a good enough answer, because Gears gives us an auto-upgrade path, like browsers that we like, right? Browsers that are giving us the new stuff fast have auto-upgrade paths. A lot of them can get away with it because they don't have a lot of market share. But that's just an artifact, right? If we get the auto-upgrade path for the renderer but not the Chrome, are we in a better position? I'd argue that we are. Gears might get us part of the way there. It can't affect markup, but it can affect the APIs that we're using. And maybe eventually it'll be able to affect markup. And there's a big question about markup. Have we wrestled really with the effects of throwing markup under the bus? If we all go to shipping Flex and Flash down the wire, compiled bytecode down the wire, do we get ourselves in a better position for the web? And I think the answer to this is bound up in the question of, is the difference between describing something with markup and describing something with code the difference between an application and a page, or is it different than that? Can there be entire classes of applications that can still be accurately described with the semantics of markup, but without a lot of help from code? And I think the answer to that is going to define what it is we should be doing with regards to code, with regards to markup. The HTML5 working group so far has done a really good job, and I'm incredibly grateful at what they've done with regards to speccing things out like lazy loading of data in a declarative way. But the question still remains for things which want to go spider this content. How hard is it to get in? How hard is it to analyze? And how many relationships can we draw from it? So my short answer to all of this is that markup can get us probably 80% of the way where we want to go. The question is how quickly, and will it be enough? Will it be soon enough? Will it be ubiquitous enough? Can we flush out the old stuff out of the ecosystem quickly enough to make a difference? And these are kind of the open questions. And I just want to open things up for questions now. Well, we've still got a little bit of time. So, are there any questions? Does everyone think I'm crazy? Yeah, GWT. So I think GWT is a mistake from an evolutionary perspective. I don't think it's a mistake from an engineering perspective. I think it's one of these things where it causes huge negative externalities, both to the applications that it is built with and to other things that want to consume that content. So it's like Flex in the same way, right? If I put a bunch of content in a page in Flex, it's caught up in bytecode. The same thing is effectively true when you treat the browser as assembler. You catch everything up. All the semantics that you meant to convey, even if they could be conveyed in markup, they're lost, right? You have to be running a full browser to interpret any of them. And then you don't have the implicit agreement of markup as a semantic for saying, oh, that's an anchor. I know what that means when I click it. I know that it means go over there. There's none of that easy to digest understanding. And so it's very difficult to kind of get what you mean by that. Now, on the upside, and the reason that I think it's successful and will be successful, is that it does give you a lot more capability and it gives you the ubiquity you want, right? So it makes it harder to spider your stuff. You have to build a second version for SEO, but you can, and it doesn't require a plugin to deploy. So if you're willing to pay all of those costs to get all of that benefit, you can do it. But there's no longer that implicit bundling of that benefit with paying the upfront cost. And so I think fewer people will do it, and therefore it's a larger negative externality. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. There's a microphone back there, and I think there's another microphone up here if you've got another question. Are there other questions? All right. Okay. Oh, yeah?
I have one. So do you think that there's a big difference between the monopoly that happens with like an open source browser like Firefox and to proprietary browsers, or do you think it's sort of the same evolution?
I think it's to be determined, right? We haven't seen an open source browser kind of take over. We haven't seen a community-built browser be the thing that wins yet. So let's say Firefox or WebKit do take over. There's a very real chance that WebKit is going to be the browser for mobile devices. I think a very high chance. Between Android and the iPhone and Series 60, there's all kinds of momentum behind WebKit on mobile devices. Is it different in kind? Probably. Because it reduces the risk to any of those companies who are shipping it because they can have a seat at the table if the project is well run. This is a big problem in the open source world, I think, right now, that we don't understand the difference between open code and open projects. So WebKit, insofar as it's run as an open project, does a lot to allay those fears. If WebKit was run as a closed project like it had been early on, I don't think it would be a net win. Now that WebKit is kind of an open project, there's external committers, there's a process for getting your code in, I think it's a good thing.
So it's a very interesting analysis that if, since developers really care about the new features, and in theory we could all be rallying around Gears and trying to ship Gears for all our users and trying to push a lot of developer support. It's open source. And it's interesting that hasn't happened. My guess is partly people just haven't thought about it enough, and partly there's this bit of a chicken and the egg thing about since there's not a lot of people running Gears, can you really target that or whatever? But it seems like if a bunch of big players got together and said, yeah, we're going to try to make everybody have this, like it happened pretty ubiquitously, pretty quickly with Flash. Is that, you think, basically your advice out of this analysis is that all the people shipping web apps and trying to build businesses on the web should be trying to form a coalition to get everybody to ship this stuff and put a lot more developer resources on it? I
think there's a really strong business case for companies that have a lot of web content in order to get behind Gears. I think unlike Flash, the case for users is weaker. There's no thing that I click on to get the dancing monkey with Gears, right? Like, it doesn't make that better. It doesn't give me a flashier UI right now. It can't affect the rendering pipeline right now. I think when Gears can affect the rendering pipeline, it's an easier sell to end users. The offline stuff is really awesome, right? That's starting to get there. That's a brand new capability, and I think as that gets introduced to users, that'll be pretty sexy. But why companies like eBay and Yahoo have not started to throw entire teams behind Gears development is a complete mystery to me. I think strategically they're idiots for not doing it.
Another Gears question. It sounds like from making an analogy with the browsers, if Gears were to get to 50% and stop, that would actually hurt us more. Do you think that that's true?
It might. You're right that it might. So one of the things that we've done with browsers is where there have been uneven implementations, where there's been uneven diffusion through the network. Let's say we get offline through Firefox, and we get offline through IE8, and we get offline through Gears. And Gears covers 60% of the people who couldn't get it through the other browsers. We've got the basic capability, and the question is if we can get it through relatively the same mechanism, through all of those things, we can cobble together some kind of rough coverage, right? We can get some kind of rough ubiquity, and that's where we've been with the JavaScript toolkits today. We've built rough ubiquity out of disjoint pieces that didn't look like they were going to fit together so far. And so if that's the outcome, I think we're in a good place. Now, if you've got the same 50% of the people who have Gears also have Firefox 3, not so big a win. Or Browser Plus, for that matter. Yeah. Anything else? Hi.
Just a real quick one. You didn't mention much about indexing the web in relationship to your topic. What's the future of the indexing the web versus desktop clients, more desktop client type apps, player type apps?
Can you help? So the question was indexing versus desktop apps. Do you mean in terms of spidering the content?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I covered it obliquely. So things that aren't text are really hard right now to spider. Now, I don't think that's an overall problem. I think the issue is going to be a question of semantics. So let's say inside of a Silverlight application, if there's a canonical way for the XAML code to declare that something is a link to go to someplace else, it's just a question of getting those things that spider to be able to understand and process that XML dialect. I don't think that's any more difficult than what we're doing right now with HTML necessarily. The other side of it is that if it's a bytecode format and it's not markup at all, that's a huge change. And that's where Flex and GWT get you into really hot water, where you have to provide a completely different alternative for things that are going to spider you. They're going to do SEO. They're going to go help you build those relationships back up. And so I think that's where the potential cost of things that aren't text on the wire really comes into play. Yeah. Okay, I guess last question, and I'll talk in the hall.
What do you see in the very long term for this? What's the end game?
It's a related rates problem. So the question was, what's the end game? Where does this all go? And it's a related rates problem. Silverlight and Flex, and to a lesser extent GWT, are currently mining the cost associated with providing superior capabilities onto a platform that otherwise couldn't address it. If browsers get those capabilities and they become relatively ubiquitous relatively quickly, and I mean by that about 2 years, if we can get IE6 out of the ecosystem in 2 years, if we can get new browsers into the hands of everyone who's not running IE on a day-to-day basis, then I think we're in a good spot for Markup and HTML as we know it to kind of continue on its evolutionary path. Now, we don't have a lot of headroom left on the current browsers. We're pushing IE6 and IE7, Firefox 2, and Safari 2 as far as we can push them, right? We're tapped out, right? With Ajax toolkits and JavaScript the way it is right now, we're tapped out. And the only thing that's going to help those deployments, that percentage of the browser population is going to be Moore's Law. But I'm guessing that if they're not upgrading their browser, they're also not upgrading their PC, or they'd have a new browser. So
you see a proprietary future in the long run?
Not necessarily, no, not at all. I don't see a proprietary future. The hope is always alive for HTML because it is going to be the Chrome, right? No one else is shipping a browser aside from a browser vendor today. There's like not a desktop browser competitor. And as a result of that, if everyone has to ship their thing through the HTML browser, HTML always has a fighting chance, even if it loses a particular battle. HTML has always been worse. It's always been the worst thing for any particular task, but it's always had ubiquity on its side. I don't see that particular thing changing. The question for us is going to be how quickly can we change out the renderers? And I don't think any of the browser vendors have a really good story on that right now, aside from forced auto upgrades, and that has huge side effect costs, particularly for businesses. All right, that was the last question. So we'll talk in the